Please welcome Alex Fayette, Principal at ACME Capital.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fireside chat on the advanced systems track of the conference today here for the Tough Tech Conference. I'm Alex Fayette, an investor at ACME Capital. We're an early stage venture firm based in San Francisco with more than $1 billion in capital under management. We are early stage investors that invest in everything from lingerie and beauty products to quantum computers and rocket ships. And today it's my incredible pleasure to invite a great friend of mine and someone at that later point I just said, the rocket ship side, Adam London, who is the co-founder and CTO of Astra. We were privileged enough to lead Astra's Series A investment all the way back in 2016. And recently this company went public to be the first pure play space launch company to have a public listing. Now, Adam, just as a quick introduction to his background, prior to co-founding Astra, he started a business called Ventions. And before that, he actually does have a tie here. Well, there's McKinsey, but then he also has a tie here to the MIT community, which I know is core to this conference. So, Adam, do you want to give a quick run through? Because I think this is always a lot of fun of what actually you worked on for your PhD at MIT and how that sort of ties into today.
Yeah, certainly. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Alex, and everyone else. Excited to be here and chat a bit about kinds of things we've been working on at Astra. But yeah, going way back, I did both my undergrad and grad school at MIT in course 16, Aero-Astro, and my PhD was building basically a rocket engine made from silicon wafers. And so I made a rocket engine that's like about this big, one of the smallest liquid-cooled engines, I think, ever, and was a fascinating experience to sort of look at bringing different ways of manufacturing to how does one create rocket engines and taking really, really big rockets and making them incredibly and almost too small. We are now working on making big rockets of more reasonable size.
Yeah, I was going to say, normally when we're sitting together, you actually have some of these hanging around almost in museum-like displays, but definitely working on something a little bit bigger these days, to say the least.
But still small.
But still pretty small. But let's just talk for a second about Astra and what the heck does Astra actually do?
Yeah, so our mission is to improve life on Earth from space. And we think about this as how do you build the sort of necessary space infrastructure to make space a bigger part of what happens on the planet. And we started that first question with how do we make launch ubiquitous, right? And so for a long time, lots of companies have built very big rockets that are highly reliable and launch every so often. And we asked the question, like, what would it look like if you could have daily access to space? And how do we sort of change the way one thinks about getting to space to make it much more accessible to all the different companies and applications and ideas that are out there to use space and make particularly low Earth orbit part of the economic sphere of Earth in a way that it isn't today.
Now, I just saw online a great video that Astra just had its 5-year birthday, as it were, and back when we first met you guys, it was definitely a little bit more of a humble endeavor, maybe than it's turned into today. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because you guys are probably one of the few groups out there that have, started to build successful, rockets originally from a garage. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that story?
Yeah, as we got started, we were in a garage south of Market in San Francisco with Astra, and that sort of came out of the work that I had done for the previous 10 years around what are the technologies that are required to take the things that make big rockets possible and shrink them. And that company actually started in my own garage in San Francisco before we moved to the bigger garage there. But Astra sort of came to be in that garage with about 10 people when we met you and did our Series A. Pretty quickly, we moved to a not quite a garage, but this incredible building that the Navy built here in Alameda and used for jet engine testing. We took over and had a place where we could build rockets, a small room for all of our desks, and 2 giant concrete former jet engine test cells that we turned into a rocket engine test cell so we could build and design and test rocket engines all in one place, mere feet from each other.
It's such an interesting point because I think maybe unlike many other emerging technology companies out there, the story of your real estate and where the company's actually been doing the building that it's doing has actually been so integral to I think the evolution here. Again, this garage, first your garage, then this garage in Soma in San Francisco, that it looked like you guys were a brewery rolling a big metal tanks in and out of the garage door.
When we were a stealth space company and people would ask what we were doing, we're like, oh yeah, we brew beer and here are our big tanks, et cetera, and that kind of thing. But,
yeah, there's actually some fun artifacts out there for people who are at all connected with Astra. They made some great T-shirts for their team, which are all black T-shirts with all black writing on them that actually does say Stealth Space Company before Astra came out of stealth. But one of the important next steps that happened for you guys was this facility that you're talking about in Alameda. And it was this kind of interesting space. It was an abandoned naval facility. Actually, this is where they shot the big car chase scene. I think in the Matrix sequel was kind of just down the street.
Out on the runway, yeah.
Out on the runways. But this was an abandoned site. They used to take jet engines out of Navy fighter jets, do repair work on them, turn them on while they're bolted down and make sure that they're running right before they throw them back in. But, ironically, this abandoned space is kind of ideal for what you guys are doing, right?
It's incredible. We, a big focus of ours is how do we shorten the cycle from design to test to learn. And to do that, one of the things that we really believe in is we need to have as much on-site test capability as possible. And so before we did anything else, we found this building in Alameda and worked with the city of Alameda to switch its use. They had not even put it up for lease because they figured no one would want something crazy like this.
Well, I think it also had 3 inches of standing water on the floor. And
yeah, it was a mess. They were storing all of the old plans from the building department in the high bay, and they were storing broken radiators and air conditioners in the test cells and things like this, and a broken fire engine outside. And so we came in we have the perfect reuse of this facility to use it actually for what it was intended to do. They were excited. We're able to test rocket engines there, and the sound suppression and noise that the Navy put in so that they could locate it fairly near the residential things that are in Alameda allows us to test not huge rockets, but the size that we need to do in a way that doesn't disturb the neighbors and lets us have a really tight design, development, and test cycle.
It's one of the most interesting things I think about Astra, and this is something that you and obviously your co-founder, Chris Kemp, the co-founder and CEO of Astra, you guys have been focused on since day one. Back when we first met you, and again, it's a story that we at ACME love to tell. You guys came in, obviously, impressive fellows, both of you, but you came in more or less with a presentation and a spreadsheet, right? You didn't have this test facility yet. There weren't rocket, engines we could hold or, nose cones we could take a gander at. But one of the core tenets of what you and Chris envisioned here was this iteration cycle that you just talked about and how that feeds into some of the spaces that we found. Talk a little bit about how this iteration cycle for you guys is just so different than how aerospace has been done basically forever.
Yeah, I think that aerospace, and I wouldn't say that it's been forever, because I think that in the very early days of aerospace, even really up to the moon landing, there was a tremendous amount of iteration and experimentation. But over the years since then, as for good reasons, as payloads became more and more precious, and we as a nation got better at understanding what was going on in aerospace, there was this need for perfection, right? We were launching people into space and we didn't want anyone to be injured or killed. And we were launching these, in many cases, billion-dollar national assets that really needed to work and needed to get to where they were going to go. And so there was this huge push for reliability and sort of perfection in particularly launch vehicles. And I think that led to sort of one way of doing things, which is to frankly overly engineer and be very conservative in your process and your processes and check everything. And you have, the weight of the rocket and like 16 times the weight of that in paper that demonstrates that it does exactly what it wants to do. And what was clear to us, back then, and you mentioned the spreadsheet, was that satellites were changing, very fundamentally. Yeah. The Moore's law and the kinds of things that enable cell phones to be its size and do the things that they can do would have a knock-on effect and have had a knock-on effect. And satellites are becoming smaller. And instead of building one big satellite to do a mission, more and more people are building hundreds or thousands of satellites and distributing them to do different and more interesting missions. And at that point, the individual satellite is less precious, frankly. And so one can afford to have a different view of what is the kind of global optimum way to serve and get that to space. And so we said, we're not going to shoot for 100.00 or 6 nines of reliability, right? We're going to back off from that. And that's going to allow us to make a simpler, less expensive system that can actually scale in production. And we want to be much more automotive-like in the way we think about designing and building rockets than the traditional aerospace kind of way.
Yeah, you're trying to make the Ford Model T here of rockets. You're not trying to make the Ferrari necessarily.
Yeah, exactly.
But that iteration mindset, and this is something I think we've seen just being on the journey with you. There's a little bit more Silicon Valley-ness to it, right? It's not necessarily move fast and break things, but it's how do you do these experiments really cost effectively, really quickly, get the feedback from those experiments, digest them quickly, and then very, very rapidly iterate again. And I mean, this test facility that we were talking about, that first space in Alameda, actually empowered you guys to do that in a way that maybe no one in the world working on space launch systems could do, right?
Yeah, we the story we like to tell is early on we got to a point where we also brought in an in-house machining capability, a machine shop, and so that was in the back sort of loud machine room of the test cell, and then the engines were on the other side, and the engineers were in the low bay, and then we built rockets in the high bay. But there were a number of times where we would test an engine in the morning, realize that there was something wrong, have the machine shop make a part change, a new design of some element or whatever, put it back on the engine and test again in the afternoon, and basically go from test to data to new design to new data, in a day. Okay. And that just doesn't happen ever. And so if you think about how do you then expand that to the full rocket as a whole, like when we went out there, our objective for our first rocket, as you know, was not to get to orbit. Like we built a rocket we knew was going to fail, but we did it as within a year and a half of our Series A, so that we could learn from the entire process and system of going through that, from building a whole launch site and transporting it up there and not having to build a dedicated site that's fixed to the location. That this idea of a fully portable launch system. We did the full iteration of that, learned so much, even though the rocket didn't go that far, that we were able to turn around and do another iteration about 6 months later, which had a bunch of improvements in it that we've been working on. And at that point, we sort of looked out at the market and had been talking to customers and realized we actually built a rocket that was a little too small. And so we spent another year and a half and built a whole new rocket. And that actually is the one that we are now have been testing. And so I think that, in general, I found throughout the years, right, you're not as smart as you think you are in almost all cases. And that the true test is and the true customer in many ways is Mother Nature, right? And so how do you go take what you think you know, learn what you actually didn't know, and learn as quickly as possible? And sort of how do you design your business, frankly, and your business case such that you can do that over and over again, and in the end get to a better result faster than if you tried to do the perfect thing at the beginning.
It's not treating this too preciously. And what I think you were mentioning before is everyone was out there trying to man rate their rockets, keep them safe to put people in. We don't need to do that at Astra, right? We're putting up things that are a little bit smaller than that and not quite human lives, but again, getting to that point and not being so precious about this technology, and instead being okay when things don't go right, as long as we're learning from it and can iterate quickly. But on some of that point, Astra wasn't necessarily the first company to build rockets. Obviously, NASA's been doing it for a good long while. Some of the big aerospace guys have been doing it. Of more of the startup-y newer entrants, SpaceX has definitely been around for a while, and even some of the current competitors to Astra had actually started quite a while before Astra did. Talk a little bit about what you and Chris saw was missing from this market. Where was the opportunity that no one else was really touching on?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we looked at the situation in 2015, 2016, it was pretty clear to us that, fundamentally, it was this sort of spreadsheet that you talked about. Like, people were focusing, particularly in the sort of small rocket space, on how do you make a pretty high performing, not quite Ferrari-ish and sort of, solve thing. And people were not focusing on the real economics. Like, I spent time after my PhD at McKinsey thinking about a lot of kind of economic problems in manufacturing and things like that. And like, when you come down to it, a rocket isn't that complicated of a thing structurally, particularly if you make it at the appropriate size where it's not hard to build tooling and things like that. And so we really spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to mass manufacture a rocket, and why does a rocket today cost as much as it does, and where can we go in? And we actually built the spreadsheet Alex talked about. Was well before we started, we built a full bill of materials for what would be required to do a rocket, and looked at how does the way you make different components change as you think about different scales, and what do we think is possible from a cost perspective as you really get economies of scale of production and manufacturing into aerospace in a way that hasn't happened before.
Yeah, and I think you guys probably had this stat at some point. There's probably fewer parts in an Astra rocket right now than, plenty of cars that are on the street with, I believe the science term is gajillions of, little tiny pieces. It's actually, what you've built is a lot more simple than an outside observer may understand at first.
Yes, and we certainly aspire to make it even more simple, right? I go around frustrated that it's as complicated as it is, and we spend a lot of time thinking about, one of our mantras is simple scales, and so how do we actually make it simpler and take components and functions out over time that enable us to get to, higher and higher production rates, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so simple when you say it and obvious, but actually that's kind of an audacious idea here, especially in aerospace. Like what you're saying, everything is over-engineered for all this extra margin, and we're trying to figure out how can you take this into its simplest form. I mean, there's some things maybe you can speak to around how Astra has tackled this more specifically. I mean, one that I know that you and Chris, talked about to great length is bringing that machine shop in, and instead of doing all of these really fancy and expensive things like, carbon fiber, 3D printed everything on the rocket, you went to a much more simple approach for manufacturing a lot of these pieces, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're very focused on aluminum and sheet metal and really trying to make it more like the way cars are put together, particularly modern electric cars, which are mostly aluminum for weight. Like there's a lot of technology that the automotive industry has developed over the past 15 or 20 years that we can apply ultimately to mass producing the large structures that make up a rocket. And then the other challenge is, how do we make the rocket engine itself as simple as possible? In many ways, right, you think about what an internal combustion engine is, and we're sort of moving away from that now. Yeah. But they're really complicated devices. You think about all the levers and valves and like pistons and et cetera. Like a rocket engine actually is a pretty simple thing in consideration. It's just that it does need to be fairly precise, and there aren't that many of them made, right? And so we spend a lot of time thinking about what are the manufacturing techniques that can be brought to bear to simplify and dramatically reduce the cost of all of these things that are moderately complex, but not super complex.
And obviously, to do all of this, you need to hire a lot of great people, and maybe dovetailing into what you were just saying. I think from an outside observer looking in, they would imagine that the team over at Astra is just, bursting with nothing but aerospace engineers and rocket scientists, running around. There's obviously, plenty of those folks, yourself included. You guys also had to attract a lot of other types of talent, though, to make this vision a reality, right?
We did. And if anything, sort of, I'm thankfully in a minority in some regards, in that one of the nice benefits of being based in the Bay Area instead of where a lot of the sort of traditional aerospace and rocket kind of companies are, is that we are forced to have a team with a sort of more diverse set of backgrounds, right? And so, and by design, we try to do that because I think that, what we're trying to do is incredibly hard from a sort of physics perspective, right? Accelerating something to 8 kilometers a second is daunting. And so it requires a lot of interesting solutions if you want to do that also in a way that is as simple as possible. And so by bringing in people from automotive, we have a ton of people come out of the racing industry. And then in Silicon Valley, there's medical devices and obviously lots of good software and autonomous kinds of talent. And so it's been great that we've been able to build such a team with such diverse backgrounds, because I think it really helps us solve these interesting problems in ways that you wouldn't see if everyone already knew how to make rockets.
That's right. I mean, just to highlight maybe one individual in particular, Benjamin Lyon, who more recently joined the Astra team. He's an Apple alum. That he's probably as far away from building rockets as you could be, while still being a very technical engineer. But he brings some different perspectives to this, right? And how does he complement what you guys are doing?
Well, it's been such a great addition to the team, and I think that he brings a great perspective on what does it mean to really take something from development and proof of concept. He was involved in a lot of the core technologies that Apple developed over the years, and went from hey, some amazing technology that someone had in a lab somewhere, and figure out how do you make that at iPhone scale, right? And so the idea of taking a development technology, et cetera, and really understanding what is actually the hard parts and getting that into production and getting that into scale and sort of solving all of those kinds of problems, as well as, the nice thing about the kinds of products that Apple works on is they're highly integrated, right? And so the software and hardware is very tightly coupled and has to be tested and developed together. And that's the definition of a rocket as well. One of the things that I love about aerospace is that it's a closed system. And when we press the button, the rocket has to do its thing. It's an autonomous flying robot, right? It all by itself has to get into orbit, and everything is so tightly coupled. And so the trades and the optimizations are always very interesting. And it intellectually, it's fun in that regard.
And it's not just about having talent who can, solve the problems at the end of the day. A lot of this is also about moving really quickly. And as we alluded to earlier, Astra just celebrated its 5th birthday. But if you sort of compare Astra against all the other folks who've tried to tackle the challenge of, like you said, accelerating something up there to 8 kilometers a second, you guys have moved a lot faster than I think most people would necessarily expect for a company doing what you're doing. Isn't that right?
I like to think so. Yeah, we definitely, from particularly since this is kind of our second major design, right? It's sort of a year and a half from new design to actually first tests and attempts of that orbital class rocket is great. And obviously that by design built on the learnings that we had from the previous 2 rockets that we had done, right, also kind of in that time frame. So we do think a lot about speed, right? Certainly as a founder. And as a startup that is, sending money away, speed matters, right? And mostly the thing that we try to optimize for is how do we maximize learning, right? And so what are the appropriate risks to take? And so we knowingly go to the launch site with a rocket that isn't perfect and has a bunch of risks, but we believe always that we're going to learn more from launching it than from doing additional and incremental testing. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about speed, about optimization, about things like how do we bring our machine shop in-house? What is the physics minimum time between doing X and doing Y? And how do we optimize? And where does it make sense to hire an airplane to fly the rocket to Kodiak instead of putting it on the boat to save the 10 days transit if we can sort of pre-position other things? So we spend a lot of time thinking about timelines and speed and optimizing not just the sort of engineering and hardware, but the programmatic side of things as well.
And now, obviously, since Astra is a public company, you guys are doing this building and learning, in public, right? This is no longer behind some dark curtain or something. The world, competitors, other folks in this space ecosystem actually get to see how you guys are moving quickly. When you learn something, whether it's good or bad, they actually get to sort of ride along with you. And so what's it
Everyone
like?
got to see our exciting sort of sideways launch last time.
Well, yeah,
which was great fun.
Let's talk about that, which was a lot of fun. This was LV6, right? So this was the sixth vehicle.
It was, yeah.
And as some folks watching may have already seen it. If not, absolutely go check it out. It's on YouTube. Was a attempt of a test launch with the vehicle. This was a few months back, right?
Yeah, just about 2 months ago.
About 2 months ago, up in sunny, beautiful Kodiak, Alaska, which is also sort of pictured in Adam's background with one of the other launch vehicles. And this launch attempt, again, it was a test, didn't go exactly perfectly, right? But you definitely learned some stuff.
We learned a lot. I remember standing in our high bay. We have mission control here in Alameda remotely, so we only have a few people up at the launch site. Watching on the big screen, counting down, feeling excited, a little bit nervous as one always does. We get to 0, the flame comes out, and the rocket doesn't move, which is very odd because usually it moves pretty quickly. And then suddenly it starts to tip, and I'm like, uh-oh, I know what's coming next. Usually when rockets start to sort of tip over like that, you end up with a fireball. Yeah. But instead, the rocket caught itself and was able to sort of basically continue its mission. And we obviously did a pretty deep investigation into what are all the things that happened and caused that. We've identified the issues and have made some changes to the next rocket. And the next rocket is actually now up at the launch site, getting prepared to do the next launch attempt.
But walk us through a little bit of what it's like at Astra when, so something hasn't gone perfectly with the launch. What happens next? How do you guys start gathering that data? How do you structure the teams to go working on this to figure out root cause issues and then try to get to solutions?
Sure. I mean, I think we have a process that we put together of after any test, whether it's the expected result or not the expected result, we go through a data review and get a lot of people's eyes on it to make sure we're not missing things. But in this case, we basically pretty quickly stood up our accident investigation group and went in and gathered all of the data and began the process of identifying the 3 or 4 things that could have potentially contributed to this thing, working through root cause analysis on each of them, gathering all the data that's pertaining. We pretty quickly figured out what the chain of events was from all the data that we're gathering to do it. And then we move into now that we understand what happened, what are the direct causes and things we need to fix to sort of directly fix it, but also what are the deeper causes, be they organizational or have misprocessed or whatever, and how do we also make changes to improve those? So it's all about gathering information, learning from it, and feeding back that learning into our overall company.
That's right. It's so interesting. And I think for probably a lot of people watching this discussion as well, it's interesting how you guys explore this, not just from the product perspective, right, but also from this operations and team perspective, because the Astra team now it's more than 300 folks on the team at this point.
I think not quite, but just about that. Yeah,
just about it. It's like 3 times bigger than it was a year ago or more. But it's that factors in ultimately in how the team works together, how processes, how information and experimentation is conducted and communicated across that team is maybe just as important to solving some of these challenges as do we need to make a part differently?
Yeah. There are many days where I think, the rocket science is the easy part, right? And how do you think about running the business and organizing the business and making sure that all the people are being as effective and as they can be is the hard part. And those of you out there who have been through scaling and sort of seen that know that going from order 80 to 100 people to order 300 people is one of the hardest transitions I think that a business can make, because you get to the point, you go from the point where everyone already knows each other and sort of has the built-in communication pathways to one where you need to rapidly educate and bring new people up to speed and help them understand what is the Astra culture and why is the Astra culture, and then also build in the organizational and sort of communication processes so that you don't end up with silos and different people not working together on sort of the common goal and focus. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about that within the company, within the management team on those kinds of issues.
And for this, this launch attempt, the LV6, we just talked a little bit around some of the stuff that was the challenge there. And I think, Benjamin and you maybe did a blog post or something that got released a week or two ago that goes into a lot more detail if anyone wants to read that. And I think that transparency is something that no one, in this universe, I think has maybe ever done before for launch vehicle. But besides the challenges and you guys sort of navigating that, there was also some really positive learnings that came out of this attempt too, right? On one side, there was a fix to prior issue and iteration that you guys navigated.
Yeah, the launch before this one was December of last year, and that was tremendously successful for us, right? Yeah. That rocket came just short of reaching orbit. And in fact, had we conducted the exact same launch from Cape Canaveral, we would have reached orbit. It's just that reaching orbit, flying from Kodiak is harder, and so we're pushing ourselves. But it was so successful that we actually decided not to just go fix the little problem, but to actually make some upgrades to the rocket over the course of this year. And then we came up with Launch Vehicle 6, which we were just talking about, which has more capacity and a bunch of upgrades relative to the other. And the nice thing about the flight, the fact that we demonstrated our GNC software and people are incredible.
I was going to say for most people who are in the experts in this space, or I would say, sorry, the sort of the armchair viewers, when they see the video for LV6, like, oh God, the rocket, it's, tipping over. The experts in the space seeing this go, oh my God, the GNC team at Astra has to just be the best in the world because this is incredible.
And so we definitely got a lot more experiential data on how well the GNC works than we anticipated, but it's good to sort of expand the margins and understand what's going on there. The most important thing, though, the thing that caused the previous rocket to fall just short was the ratio in which we were consuming propellants was not as well controlled. We basically didn't give the GNC enough latitude of control on the launch last December. And we had adjusted all of that. And so the great news from this flight was the flight data was showing that was fully resolved and that the propellants were being depleted equally. And so we believe we addressed the one remaining issue that we had seen there. And we also got data on a lot of the improvements that we have made. And so we're excited to see what this next iteration that is up in Kodiak now teaches us once it launches.
How do you then balance, both as a founder and manager, but also obviously, an engineer and a leader in that, balance this iteration and innovation, both on the technical side, but then also the execution side, right? Some of what you've been talking about is advancing the technology, and other pieces are advancing the making and launches of rockets. How do you sort of navigate that balance?
I mean, it's tricky. We talk a lot about, global optimization, which kind of gets to that, right? And so we don't want engineers and folks to go off and optimize their small little part of the system at the expense of the overall thing, right? In many cases, it's better for them to make their system a little heavier so that it's much easier to be manufactured, or even perform a little bit less well because that allows some other part of the system, which is heavier or more costly, to change its performance by much more, right? And so there is a need to sort of make sure that you have the kind of communication across the different teams, and then you just reinforce this idea of think as high level as you can and do what is optimum for Astra, not what is optimum for any subcomponent thereof.
Yeah, I mean, you and Chris have done, saying this as a very, very proud, investor in you guys. From very early on, I think both of you saw the value in setting key cultural tenets of Astra to the team. And really drilling that into to everyone who's worked there. Because, as you're pointing out, some of these actually end up paying dividends to the process and innovation that you have to go through today. And these aren't just a manager telling someone, hey, you got to do X, Y, or Z. These are more or less true North Stars of the culture.
It is. And I think that culture is something that evolves and one needs to sort of keep an eye on it. And so one of the things that we've been working on this year is like one of the things that needs to happen as a company gets bigger is you think about adding processes and sort of adding some additional checks, right? But you need to do that sort of with a philosophy behind that, right? And so it's easy to kind of over-index on like, we're not going to have any issues. And so everything's going to get checked by very senior people, but like, that's not scalable. And it frankly de-empowers the people who actually know the most about it, right? And so we try to think about setting up, guardrails as opposed to approvals in some cases, right? And it's about sort of changing in some regards the way in which you talk about and focus. And it is ultimately sort of a cultural thing of like what really matters to Astra, right? And what is it that we value? And to us, it comes back to things like maximize learning, right? Or optimize globally or things like that.
Yeah. So let's maybe take a step, higher level than Astra for a little bit, and just talk about what's going on in the innovation, side of the space ecosystem, because I think Astra is playing a really key role here, but there's also a lot of other activity going on, and one of the ideas that we've talked about, you and Chris have talked about, quite a bit when talking about Astra as a company, is evolving, for lack of a better word, space broadly into a new platform in the truest sense of the word. And how are you guys approaching that? How do you think Astra fits into this, and where do you think it's going?
Big questions. I think that, as I said, one of our tenets is this idea of how do we move the economic sphere of activity of humanity about 300 to 500 kilometers higher or bigger, right, to encompass Leo. And to do that, I do think that you really need to invest and think about how do you enable other people to do that? Because we're not going to do that ourselves, right? And so this gets back to the idea of what do people need in order to make space more accessible, not just from a physical sense of like launching there, but actually using it, right?
Well, let's actually just double click on that for a second. Like what are the biggest needs in your mind that Astra and other people are trying to solve for to make this more accessible?
I think there are a couple of things. There's access is one thing. And so we've talked a lot about launch, right? Yeah. The other thing is that let's say you're a new entrepreneur and you want to do something cool in space, right? Today, it is still a little bit too much like, okay, I want to go build a business, but first I have to learn how to make a satellite, right? And so others and us as well are thinking about that problem and like, how do we make it so you can go from, let's say concept to constellation in months instead of years, right? So that if you have a great idea or a sensor or something like that, you can come to Astra and you don't have to bring us a satellite to launch. You can bring us a sensor to launch and we can figure out how all the other complicated parts about getting you data to prove that your business is worthwhile. And you don't have to wait, for launch delays and, worry about running out of money.
It's actually a pretty crazy idea, right? Because before now, in order to do anything like what you just said, you need to have a lot of expertise. You need to have a lot of capital. And you can't really do any amount of onesies and twosies, right? You go big or you go home. And that's not what you're talking about here. You're talking about something really different.
Correct. We talk about like, is there a way to create something that's a little bit more like the transition that you saw in tech around like people used to build data centers and now they build their proof of concepts and even operate things on AWS, right? And so like, what is the sort of infrastructure equivalent that needs to exist in space to sort of make it more accessible? To do that, like there are a couple different problems to be solved, right? One is a technical thing in that they're pretty expensive and complicated and difficult technologies that have been optimized again for sort of legacy space that don't work as well if you're trying to think about space at scale. And so there are technologies that we can invest in to make it easier to sort of quickly assemble a space mission. And so an example of one of those things is propulsion. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we acquired Apollo Fusion.
I was going to say, Mike Cassidy and his team are focused on a very specific, what are challenges you're talking about?
When you're in space, when you think about, in order to sort of have economic activity, we can't have the downsides of too much space things, of collisions and other such things. And so like you need to be able to maneuver in space. And this is a very efficient way of doing that. So there's kind of technology aspects of it. There's also, again, a manufacturing aspect of it. When you look at what is the sort of cost to produce space hardware, or really aerospace hardware, be it rockets, airplanes, satellites, and you look at like how many dollars per kilogram does it cost to make a thing that is sort of aerospace grade, it's thousands of dollars a kilogram. Right. Cars, on the other hand, are like tens of dollars a kilogram, right? And as I said, they're not actually that much different. If anything, in some ways, cars are a thing, but you make cars a different way and you make them at scale, and you've invested in sort of, the production capacity to do so. And so there is a production and a scaling question that also needs to happen in space, not just for rockets, but also for the in-space parts of things. And we think that we can take a lot of the learnings we have done from manufacturing and building rockets at scale and apply that to spacecraft as well.
Oh, that's, it's such a great point, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that within the auto industry. And I think actually, Elon has talked about this with Tesla before, is that their greatest advantage is really their factories and their manufacturing capabilities. For most of the automotive universe, the reason they're successful is that they are amazing experts in stamping out product and making it really
stamping, right?
yeah. But that's a lot of the mindset here, is that to do this enablement of the platform for others. One of the challenges that Astra in particular is tackling is, how do we start stamping out in that same mindset and build that machine to make a really consistent product to go and actually scale up. Yeah. And again, it sounds so obvious, but this isn't how aerospace works. Just to keep reemphasizing, that's not really how people have made rockets or launch systems ever before.
Or particularly satellites, which often are even more of a one-off kind of thing, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And it's actually fascinating, talking about the platform shift side of things, because we at ACME, we were frequently trying to understand when platform shifts are happening and try to invest behind them. And before, we met you and Chris, we had actually met a lot of satellite companies and that were seeking, venture capital investment. And we could sort of see where the future was going, but we were going, wow, this is at a different part of the development curve. This is like the application layer or the enablement layer of the space ecosystem. We weren't at the infrastructure phase yet. We weren't yet solving the infrastructure. And I think that's, soon after that realization that we met you guys, and that's really where you're sitting. You're sitting much more today at that infrastructure layer for this platform. But there's going to be these other steps that are coming.
Yep.
So what do you think is the most, exciting stuff that's coming next? Either within, what you can say about what Astra is focused on, and obviously as a public company, you can say some things, you can't say some other things, except that it's all exciting. But also just looking around at all the other innovation that's going on, both within launch, within satellites, within Earth infrastructure to go help stuff in outer space and vice versa. What's some of the most exciting things for you?
I think what I'm really excited to see is how people are able to really leverage this transition from a satellite as a single thing that does a mission to not to like the mission is a lot of satellites that collectively can do something different. And so you think about like in science, like the way that we get sea surface temperature data or sea altitude data is we have one satellite with a radar that sort of slowly stripes the Earth over time and it gathers the data, right? And so, but we have fairly good spatial resolution, but we don't have great temporal resolution because it takes a while for it to cover. But whereas if you could get simultaneous data from all over the globe about some of these factors, right, and integrate that into a better picture of what's going on, that's really, really interesting to me. And I think that there are lots of applications where this transition from one big satellite to lots of little satellites performing similar but slightly different missions is going to enable all kinds of interesting data gathering, more ubiquitous communication, lots of very interesting things.
What else? But there's also a lot of challenges still, right? You guys are going after one class of challenges here for this new space platform. There's a lot of other ones, and maybe go through some, the most top of mind in your mind, like, wow, these are really big problems that maybe people are chasing down solving right now, but there also are plenty that people haven't yet focused on. And what do you think are some of those biggest challenges?
The biggest challenges for sort of new and exciting applications in space.
Yeah.
I mean, I think beyond the how do you cost effectively make sure the space mission happens, there's a lot of work to be done in the sensor and sort of communication side of things, right? Mm-hmm. It turns out it's presently, pretty expensive to build a high performance communication kind of, payload to sort of fly on some of these things, right? And so lots of interesting work to be done there. There's some very interesting work to be done on, can we build, we built telescopes for a long time, right? But what is the other information that we can gather from a sensor perspective and leverage the amazing things that NASA and others have done on scientific missions and applying that to sort of generating new and different data sets about the Earth. And so I think, and a lot of that comes to how do you do things around, inexpensive, but still very interesting sensors. And I think there are interesting lessons and sort of offshoots to be gotten from some of the optical and camera and sort of cell phone kinds of sensors that are happening. Yeah. But as people look at things like, all right, how do we do radar type systems in space? How do we detect levels of methane or carbon dioxide directly? And what are the spectrometer kinds of things that we can do? A mission we're launching for NASA next year is pretty exciting. They have a number of, they're going to launch 6 small satellites that can simultaneously look at all of the sort of tropical storm activity with this sort of scanning microwave sensor, and get much better sort of how do hurricanes form and evolve data than we can presently get from the sort of wavelengths and other things that we currently observe from space. And so I think there's lots of interesting things to be done there, and sort of like gathering new and different data sets, and the core sort of payload kind of sensor technologies have a ways to do to sort of really become commercialized.
Yeah, I mean, and it's so interesting, right? Because how would this have been done before? NASA would have had to spend, I believe the technical term is like crap tons of money on a school bus sized, satellite to put on a very precious launch and, cross your fingers and hope and pray that it works once it's in whatever orbit it is. And then if you actually want any sort of coverage, like what you're talking about for this mission that they're launching with you guys on, they would have to make many school bus sized objects and put them in different places. And we're flipping this on its head. And you're saying, yeah, you can make cheaper, smaller, many of these satellites with sensors, put them in all sorts of different places and interesting orbits that give you coverage to really understand things. That the only way to do that before was how many school buses can you launch into space? And, I think another thing that you hit on, which is so interesting to folks, is that as we've moved into this small sat universe, the low Earth orbit universe, we've had this opportunity to say the electronics that you're putting inside of cell phones and iterating and advancing every year. Hey, you can fly these now because they don't need to be hardened for deeper space. They're sitting lower, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to use that technology. There's this middle ground that I think you're speaking to a little bit, which is now that we have these new capabilities to get stuff up into space exactly where you want it, when you want it, maybe we can start putting up new types of sensors and new types of technologies that we didn't quite consider applying in this way to solve these problems, right?
And back to your point around speed, like the process to qualify a sensor to fly on some exquisite NASA thing is well defined, but it's pretty long, right? And so if we can get information quicker by flying earlier generations for fairly low investment, right, we can accelerate the pace at which those sensors and other kinds of technology developments are happening. And I think that will be beneficial across everything.
You're right. I think for people who may be less familiar with the space, we're at this insane inflection point in the space ecosystem where if you want to go and design some new type of satellite, you don't need your whole satellite built and ready to go in order to validate if your hypotheses are right. You can take your subcomponents, maybe attach them on other people's, hardware, fly that, do a quick test just of that one little piece without building the whole satellite. Learn quickly, learn cheaply, go back, iterate, and figure out how to go from there. And that's pretty transformative.
Yeah, much as you would do a unit test for some new, software module or whatever,
yeah.
Right?
We're basically software-ifying what it means to build products for space. So I'm just looking at the clock here. We only have a few minutes left. I want to jump into some questions that I'm getting in the chat window here. And so how about the first one here, Adam? Did the company receive grant funding? And if so, how did you integrate that into the product and development strategy of Astra?
Good question. We did have a number of projects that we worked with the government. NASA was a sponsor of some of our first couple of flights as part of a tipping point program that they did. And in general, we tried very hard to make sure that we were able to leverage the interest and the support of elements of the government that are interested in this idea of more ubiquitous and smaller dedicated access to space. And the government's been a great supporter of us, both NASA and the military side of things, because they certainly recognize that there's a lot of new opportunities to be had in this sort of change and easier access to space for them to complete their missions.
Yeah, and maybe even there's some credit to go to Astra here of some of those grants and investment, of time and resource from the government on you guys is ultimately paying some dividends. And maybe today, just looking around at the startup ecosystem, there's probably more, grant dollars from the government out there to help support new businesses and new explorations in this ecosystem than there maybe has ever been before.
I think that's true, yeah.
So, okay, another one here is, so what are the current day-to-day challenges, going from manufacturing the smallest liquid-cooled rocket engines to now working on, making really, really, obviously bigger rocket engines, more complicated ones, and ones that have to do a lot more different things for you guys?
Yeah, good question. I think, our biggest challenges day-to-day now are around manufacturing, and, we're in the sort of first step of scale from we've been in sort of the prototype mode, and now we're into the initial kind of learning about how is it to scale into a repeatable production thing. And so a lot of that is, as many have said, like designing something is hard, producing it at scale is harder, right? Yeah. And so what are the elements of those hard? They're the little things around dealing with supply chains in the time of COVID. They're about making sure that things are sufficiently documented. They're about having the processes in place that are sufficiently onerous to be valuable, but not so onerous to be not done, right? I like to say you need to make the easiest thing to do the right thing to do whenever possible. And so a lot of it is in, I think, really building out not the sort of sexy, cool, funky rocket things, but the blocking and tackling, like how do you build a great manufacturing organization, an operational organization to go and do this? And I think there's magic when you can have that in the same building and really tightly coupled with the engineering team, because the engineers can learn so much more about how to make the next one better and easier to make when the people making it are next door, or in this case, across the aisle, and the engine can walk over into the factory and sort of help and sort of realize, and then we can turn that around. And likewise, the manufacturing focus and operational focus people can provide great suggestions back into the development cycle, and we get this this great virtuous cycle of a better and better product.
Yeah, I think it sort of would blow a lot of people's minds if they actually went on, in the Skyhawk facility for Astra, realizing this is the largest open floor plan tech company you've seen, where people can run around and collaborate. But in the background there is a house-sized lathe making rocket parts, and almost everything's on wheels, right? So as you do this iteration that you're talking about organizationally, like the factory can literally evolve and change shape.
Yeah, and it has a couple of times, right? I think that being flexible and sort of how you develop and design things is really important. And I think, one of the best decisions we made kind of along those lines was this idea of how do we not build a launch site at a launch site, but instead build a launch site here and figure out how to make it portable so that we can show up with our own launch site. And then we've already know how it works. And we've already got the bugs out.
Which, by the way, is also one of the coolest things. We didn't talk about it before is, obviously the rocket behind you is an example. You guys have made a system that fits inside of shipping containers.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, which is wild. I mean, this is so far opposite of the SpaceXs of the world. You can literally pack everything up and throw it in a truck.
Yeah, a few trucks, but
a few trucks. Fair enough. Or one really nice sized airplane. One or the other. So another question here is, how do you guys think about measuring success in the lens of improving life on Earth from space? Because it is such an audacious sort of goal that the company is focused on. How do you think about measuring that and getting some clarity into that process?
Yeah, I think it's something that we've actually talked a lot about and, are continuing to sort of work on and refine. But as we think about, what are the metrics that we want to measure around how are we doing on our mission of improving life on Earth, we think that there's sort of two things. It's like a more connected planet and a healthier planet. Mm-hmm. And so we think about all right, how do we measure how many additional people being served by Astra provided functionality, are connected than there were otherwise. And so we're actually trying to look at sort of how do we look at who are our customers helping and how do we measure that. And then we look at are there, carbon effects? Are there other on sort of how do we think about the measurements of planet? One of them is we've enabled the identification and reduction of this amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Or we're looking at particular sort of verticals and how are our systems impacting and helping those things in a way that actually is measurable. And as you can imagine, it's tricky.
It's tricky, but we're also at the sort of bleeding front edge of that. And it may not be obvious to people, but sort of the buzzwords we throw around of, ESG companies and ESG in investing. There is a real strong ESG sort of mission here for Astra of, we're going to help, make the world a better place. It's not always immediately obvious to folks what that connection is. So I think it's really helpful for you to share what you just did, because these don't happen quickly. This is going to happen over a much longer period of time. And I'm just looking at the clock here. We only have a couple seconds left, so I think we're going to wrap up this fireside chat today. Adam, thank you so much for carving out an hour with us to talk about all the amazing things that you and Chris and the team are doing at Astra, but also a little bit about what's in store both for the company and kind of the world as we look towards how to make life better on Earth from space.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been fun, and encourage everyone who's interested to follow along as we continue on the adventure and launch more and more rockets and help make space improve life on Earth.
Also, Astra is hiring like crazy, so go check out Astra.com if you'd like to go work with these guys.